This is Manhattan, the center of New York City, home to some of the most expensive land on earth, bought by the Dutch for only $24. Now, those $24 are the equivalent of a bit more than $1,000 in the modern day, but still, that's unbelievably cheap for such a strategically important land. So, how did this even happen? Who sold it to them, and how did this seemingly incredible deal turn into a years-long nightmare of disputes, repayments, and violence, ending with the Dutch eventually losing the city? Let me explain. In 1609, an Englishman by the name of Henry Hudson stumbles upon what we now know as New York. By the way, him being named Hudson is why the river flowing through New York is called the Hudson. Anyway, he's sailing on a Dutch ship, the Half Moon, under contract to the Dutch East India Company, which is why when he returns from his travels, he reports back to the Dutch what he found there. A deep, protected harbor with a big river running far inland. The tidal range is small, with moderate currents, meaning the water level and its movement is consistent and predictable. This is the kind of place where ships can easily get in and out of and trade. A harbor like this is rare, and the additional fact that there were a lot of beavers there, whose fur was very valuable back in Europe, meant that the message spread quickly. This harbor with a river into the interior basically gives you a ready-made supply chain. One could easily transport the pelts out and establish a lucrative trade business, and because the tides are steady and the channel is deep, ships can work year-round, meaning you have a stable income. Hearing this, a group of private merchants decided to form the New Netherland Company, and managed to obtain a 3-year monopoly to trade furs there. After the charter expired, in 1621 the Dutch-Spanish 12-year truce was ending, and since what is now known as the 80-year War was going to resume, the Dutch wanted a single state-backed company to handle the trade and military operations, instead of having these loose merchants competing with each other. This is where the West India Company comes in. The Dutch set up the Dutch West India Company in 1621 and gave it an exclusive trade monopoly in the Atlantic, as well as the authority to settle the land and govern it. You've probably actually heard of its better-known counterpart, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, arguably the most valuable company in history. Think of the West India Company as its Atlantic counterpart, focused on the Americas and West Africa, while the VOC handled Asia. By the way, if you want me to make a full video on the VOC, how it worked, why it was so powerful, let me know in the comments. Anyway, the plan was that under this one charter, they'd control the Atlantic routes, moving furs, sugar, enslaved people, while building forts to hold the harbor and settle the land. With Fort Amsterdam as their hub on the southern tip of Manhattan, the West India Company set about turning the harbor into a town, and to do that without a fight, they needed permission they could show on paper, so they sat down with the local leaders. The thing is, there wasn't one tribe or group that was in control of Manhattan. Different Lenape communities had stakes and claims to different parts of the land, which will become very important to remember for later. Anyway, in the end, a 1626 letter by Pieter Schagen reports that Manhattan was purchased for goods worth 60 gulden, which was later estimated at around $24. For around a decade, everything goes well, and Fort Amsterdam settles into a small town called New Amsterdam. But as New Amsterdam starts growing more and more, the very deal that made the town possible becomes the reason it starts to crack. See, the Dutch interpreted buying the land as having exclusive ownership of that land, while many local Lenape leaders understand the exchange's permission to share and keep using the land. So as the town spreads, the Dutch start marking fields and putting up fences because to them it's theirs now. But Lenape communities keep walking the same paths and using the same shoreline because to them, they're sharing the land. Officials try to calm things down by meeting with local leaders again and paying for particular spots so the papers match what's happening on the ground. And that does buy time, but it doesn't fix the core mismatch. On top of that, around the harbor, different Lenape communities use and claim the same land at different times, and the lines aren't fixed like on a Dutch map. These overlapping claims made the situation much more difficult, and arguments over fields and shore access start to add up. And when leadership changes, it escalates. Willem Kieft takes leadership of the settlement in 1638, and the hard line he brings turns the small arguments into a real conflict. By 1643, it spills into open fighting around the harbor. Trade slows for the Dutch, and peace doesn't return until 1645. New Amsterdam does survive, but it's shaken. And this matters for later, as 2 decades on, an English fleet sails into the harbour. The Dutch settlers consider their chances to win the battle, but they realized that it would take too much of a toll on the settlement than it was worth and decided to yield the town in 1664. Some people actually often say the Dutch traded New Amsterdam for Suriname, but that's not really what happened. England had already taken New Amsterdam in 1664, as I talked about, and held it. When the war between England and the Dutch Republic ended 3 years later, in 1667, the Treaty of Breda was signed, which basically said you keep what you already control. So England kept New Amsterdam, which became New York, and the Dutch kept Suriname, which they had just taken that same year. Each side walked away with what they were holding. It wasn't a swap, despite how it's often retold. There is one twist, however. 6 years after the Treaty of Breda, the Dutch briefly took New York back in 1673 and renamed it New Orange, but that didn't last long because at the next peace deal a year later, the Treaty of Westminster was signed, which restored things to how they were under the Breda Treaty. And from there, New York eventually developed into what we know it as today. For example, the street grid New York is iconic for originated in 1811. The city created numbered streets and avenues, making land easy to divide, sell, and develop, which speeds growth up. New York is also known as a financial hub. In 1792, a small group of brokers agreed to trade by set terms, the Buttonwood Agreement, and over time that became the New York Stock Exchange. And actually, another fun fact is that the name Wall Street secretly references New Amsterdam and the Dutch. Where Wall Street is located now, there used to be a wall that was built by the Dutch settlers to defend against the English, which would eventually give the name Wall Street. New York's incredible concrete jungle is also a result of the geography of Manhattan. Because the island is tight on space, once the elevator is invented and becomes more commonly used, developers start building upwards, which ultimately results in the famous skyline we see today. In the end, this story isn't about a $24 bargain. It's about proper communication and knowing what you're agreeing to. The Dutch paid a tiny price, but never fully aligned with the locals on what the deal meant. The price you get doesn't mean anything until you agree on the terms. A cheap deal can easily turn into years of repairs and conflict like it did with the Dutch, but hopefully not as bloody. What's important when entering a business with someone is that both sides are on the same page. There is no use trying to get a good deal if both sides are agreeing to different things. If you enjoyed this video, YouTube thinks you'll enjoy this one too. See you next time.